My name is Delaney Rhodes, and for 3 months, I held on to a quiet hope. I planned a surprise for my sister's wedding, something I believed might finally bring us back to each other. I arrived at Belmont Mansion carrying that hope like something fragile. Then the guard checked the list, and my name wasn't there. He looked at me with polite certainty. In that instant, as my parents turned their eyes away, I understood this wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. Growing up in Nashville, inside the same house with the same parents, you would think my sister and I would have been shaped by the same hands. But that isn't how it happened. The differences started small, so small they could be mistaken for kindness. And maybe in the beginning, that's exactly what they were. Sienna, my older sister, was always described as sensitive. That word followed her everywhere. If she struggled with homework, Mom would sit beside her immediately, voice soft, reassuring her that the assignment might have been unclear. If she argued with a friend, Dad would step in and help her draft the perfect message to smooth things over. They said they were just being supportive. They said every child needs something different, and maybe that's true. But over time, I noticed the pattern. When Sienna felt overwhelmed, the world adjusted around her. When I felt overwhelmed, I adjusted to the world, would start folding laundry and then drift off to sleep. It was in the way chores were distributed. Sienna would start folding laundry and then drift away halfway through. Mom would smile and say, "It's fine, she's tired." I would finish the basket without being asked. When bills needed organizing or forms needed signing, Dad would call me over and say, "You're good at this stuff." He meant it as praise. I took it as assignment. They believed I was steady, capable, mature beyond my age. Those words sound like compliments, don't they? And for a long time, I wore them that way. I liked being the dependable one. I liked the quiet nod Dad would give me when something complicated was handled without fuss. I liked when Mom pulled me aside and said, "I don't know what we'd do without you." But here's the part no one says out loud. When you're the strong one, you don't get to fall apart. If Sienna forgot a deadline, there was a reason. If I forgot one, I had to fix it before anyone noticed. If she snapped at someone, it was because she was stressed. If I snapped, I apologized quickly and adjusted myself. I learned early that asking for help could be interpreted as weakness, and weakness didn't fit the role I'd been given. I don't think my parents loved me less. That's not what this was. They just believed I could withstand more. And because they believed it, I did. Meanwhile, Sienna grew into someone who expected protection, not in a cruel way, just naturally. When problems appeared, she looked outward. Someone would handle it. Someone always had. She became confident in that rhythm. Confident that her needs would be met. Her discomfort softened her mistakes, reframed. And I moved in the opposite direction. I became careful, measured. Before I asked for anything, I would calculate whether it was worth the disruption. If I was hurt, I examined the feeling privately until it shrank to something manageable. I convinced myself that independence was strength, that needing less made me easier to love. Do you see how that creates distance? We were sisters, yes. We shared holidays and birthdays and late-night talks when we were younger. But underneath those moments was an imbalance neither of us named. Sienna learned to speak her wants plainly. I learned to filter mine. She walked into rooms assuming she belonged. I entered quietly, observing first. Whenever she had conflict with friends, my parents negotiated on her behalf. Whenever I had conflict, I figured it out alone. Not because I was told to, because it was understood. Over time, that understanding became the structure of our family. There were moments when I tried to convince myself it didn't matter. I told myself that roles shift as you grow up, that childhood patterns fade, but they didn't fade. They hardened. Sienna embraced her identity as the one who needed consideration. I embraced mine as the one who could carry weight. And the strange thing is, both roles were rewarded. She received protection. I received praise. But praise doesn't lighten the load. Sometimes resentment flickered in me, quick, quiet, almost shameful. It would surface when I was scrubbing dishes while she rested upstairs, or when Mom defended her for something I knew I would have been corrected for. I never let that resentment breathe for long. I would push it down and remind myself that being reliable was a good thing. Still, the space between us widened. We didn't fight. Not really. There were no dramatic shouting matches, just subtle misunderstandings. She would interpret my quietness as distance. I would interpret her confidence as entitlement. And because addressing those interpretations would have required exposing the imbalance holding our family together, we avoided the conversation entirely. On rare occasions, she leaned on me, asked for advice, needed help organizing something she felt was too overwhelming. And every time I showed up, I told myself that patience was how you preserve a bond, that if I stayed steady long enough, we would eventually meet as equals, without the shadow of our parents' expectations shaping every interaction. Mom would sometimes thank me for being the steady one. Dad would say he appreciated how dependable I was. Their gratitude felt sincere. But beneath it was a quiet acknowledgement that I was filling gaps created by their need to protect Sienna. By the time we reached our early 20s, the roles were no longer flexible. They were fixed. Sienna expected the world to cushion her. I expected myself to handle it alone. And somewhere in that pattern, something tender between us thinned. Not disappeared, just thinned. I kept hoping that adulthood would reset us, that once we stepped outside our parents' home, we'd see each other differently, without comparison, without quiet resentment, without the invisible math of who carried more. But childhood roles don't dissolve just because you leave the house. They follow you in the way you speak, in the way you ask for help, in the way you decide whether you deserve it at all. And long before the wedding, long before the gate, long before my name was missing from that list, the foundation for that moment had already been laid. By my mid-20s, the house in Nashville no longer defined the edges of my world. I accepted an offer from a financial firm in Chicago, one that valued precision, endurance, and quiet results over charm. The move felt less like an escape and more like stepping into a space where the traits I had been shaped by finally made sense. Chicago was loud in its own way, fast, demanding. The hours were long and the projects required patience that most people wouldn't see from the outside. Research negotiations, risk assessments, none of it glamorous. But I found comfort in the structure. If you did the work well, the outcome spoke for itself. No performance required, no spotlight necessary. Sienna stayed in Nashville. She built her event planning business with the same confidence she'd always carried. She had a gift for reading a room within seconds. She could sense tension before anyone said a word and smooth it over with a compliment or a quick adjustment in tone. Clients loved that about her. She thrived in spaces filled with movement venues, floral samples, tasting menus, last-minute changes that required improvisation. Where I leaned into spreadsheets and projections, she leaned into atmosphere and emotion. We both worked hard, just in different languages. At first, we tried to keep our calls regular. Sunday evenings, usually, she would talk about a wedding she was coordinating or a corporate gala that had nearly collapsed before she stepped in and rescued it. I could hear the energy in her voice when she described how someone praised her creativity or thanked her for saving the day. She repeated certain stories more than once, not out of vanity, I think, but because those moments validated her. Recognition mattered to her. Being seen mattered. When she asked about my job, I kept things brief. Partly because confidentiality was real, but partly because I didn't know how to translate what I did into something that felt interesting in conversation. I couldn't describe the satisfaction of closing a complicated deal without sounding clinical. And I had never been comfortable presenting my achievements as stories. So I said things like, "It's busy," or "We wrapped a major project this week." She would respond with a quick, "That's good," before returning to her world of venue tours and client drama. Over time, the imbalance in our conversations grew. Not hostile, not tense, just uneven. Her updates filled most of the call. Mine fit into the pauses. Mom occasionally asked why I didn't share more. I told her my work required discretion. She accepted that explanation easily. Dad focused on practical concerns, whether I was eating enough, whether the winters were too harsh. No one pressed for detail. When holidays came around, we all gathered back in Nashville. Those visits felt polite, familiar on the surface, but underneath something had shifted. Sienna would stand in the kitchen describing how fast her business was growing, how clients were recommending her to their friends. Relatives nodded, impressed. They liked her confidence. It filled the room. I stood near the counter answering questions when asked. Yes, Chicago's treating me well. Yes, work is challenging. I didn't elaborate unless someone insisted. It wasn't that I felt invisible. It was that I had grown used to occupying the background. Sienna and I would sometimes sit on the porch late at night during those visits. The air thick with Tennessee humidity, cicadas humming in the distance. She would tease me gently, saying I had become too serious, that I needed to loosen up, that Chicago had made me intense. I would smile and tell her that responsibility tends to do that. She saw ambition as something expressive, measured in applause and referrals in rooms that responded when you entered them. I saw ambition as endurance, the ability to stay steady through complexity, the quiet satisfaction of solving something difficult without needing anyone to notice. Neither of us was wrong, but our definitions of success no longer overlapped. As months turned into years, our calls became shorter. Sometimes we skipped them all together. If she was overwhelmed with a new client, she'd text instead. If I was buried in a project, I'd respond hours later with something efficient and neutral. Proud of you. Hope it goes well. Talk soon. We still said love you before hanging up, and I meant it. But love, I was learning, doesn't automatically create closeness. It requires shared space, shared understanding, and ours was thinning. My friends in Chicago noticed I rarely mentioned my sister unless directly asked. Not because I was hiding anything, just because talking about her felt like describing someone who existed in a parallel life. someone connected to me by history more than by present experience. I began to accept that our relationship had become functional. We showed up when required, we exchanged updates, we maintained peace. There was no dramatic fallout, no explosive argument that forced distance between us. Just two adults walking further into lives that reflected who they had always been encouraged to become. Sometimes, during those quiet Sunday evenings after we hung up, I would sit with a strange mixture of affection and absence. She was my sister. That fact hadn't changed. But the version of us that might have understood each other without translation felt increasingly out of reach. And still somewhere underneath that growing space, I carried the belief that if the right moment came something significant enough, we might find our way back to something deeper. I just didn't know what that moment would cost. About 6 months before the wedding, my routine shifted with a single phone call. I remember the exact tone of her voice before I even remember her words. It carried something I hadn't heard from her in a long time. Not just excitement, but certainty. The kind that settles in your chest and refuses to leave. I'm getting married. She said it like she had been holding the sentence in for years. She described the proposal in careful detail. Where it happened, what he said, the way the light hit the table, the ring, of course. I could hear her smiling through the phone, pacing as she talked, reliving each second as if it were unfolding again in real time. And something in me softened. All the distance, all the polite pauses. They stepped aside for a moment. I congratulated her without hesitation. I meant it. Whatever space had grown between us, this was still my sister. This was still a milestone that deserved to be celebrated fully. She spoke about venues, about guest lists, about how everything had to feel intentional. I recognized the confidence in her voice, the same rhythm she used when she felt completely in control of a project. She expected the family to embrace this moment, and I assured her that I would be there. Not just present, but supportive. After we hung up, I booked my flight to Nashville before I could overthink it. I rearranged meetings, cleared deadlines. I even planned to arrive early in case she needed help with final preparations. It felt like an opportunity. Weddings have a way of resetting people. They create shared purpose, shared memory. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine standing beside her without the weight of childhood roles pressing down on us. What if this was the moment we stepped into something new? A few weeks later, though, I began hearing small fragments of information that didn't match the energy she had projected. Through mutual acquaintances, careful indirect conversations, I learned that her company had entered a difficult phase. The event industry in Nashville had become unpredictable. Contracts she had counted on had fallen through. A couple of larger projects had collapsed unexpectedly. Nothing dramatic, nothing public, but enough to create pressure. I didn't call her to ask about it. That might sound cold, but I knew her well enough to understand how she would interpret it. Sienna guarded her vulnerabilities carefully, especially with me. If I approached her with concern, she would hear pity. If I offered advice, she would hear judgment. So I stayed quiet. But staying quiet didn't mean staying inactive. I reached out to a colleague in Chicago who managed a private investment fund, one that occasionally provided strategic capital to businesses that showed long-term potential, but were navigating short-term instability. I explained the situation without using her name at first. Then, when confidentiality was assured, I clarified the details. I asked a single condition. My involvement could not be disclosed. Not now. Not until I decided. The fund conducted its assessment independently. They reviewed financial statements, evaluated, risk-examined projections. It moved forward on merit, not on sentiment. And eventually approval came through. The amount was significant enough to stabilize operations, restore vendor confidence, and create breathing room. I watched from a distance as her company began to recover. New contracts appeared. Social media posts regained their confident tone. She spoke on the phone about upcoming events with renewed energy. The strain I had sensed in secondhand whispers faded. She never knew. And that was the point. This wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about positioning myself as the savior behind the curtain. I understood her pride. I understood how carefully she curated the image of self-sufficiency. If she had known too soon, she might have rejected the help out of instinct alone. I didn't want her gratitude. I wanted her stability. As the wedding approached, I started thinking about how and when to tell her. Not publicly, never publicly. I imagined a quiet moment, maybe the morning after the ceremony, or sometime during the rehearsal week when emotions were already softened. I pictured handing her something symbolic, a small box carefully chosen, inside it documentation that explained the investment. Not as leverage, as reassurance. I rehearsed the words in my mind more than once. I believed in you, I still do. That's what I wanted her to hear. Not, you needed me. Not, you couldn't do this alone. But simply that I saw her effort, that I respected the business she had built enough to protect it when she couldn't see the ground shifting beneath her. In some quiet corner of my heart, I hoped that revelation would do more than surprise her. I hoped it would rebalance something between us. For years, I had been the steady one in silence. This would be the first time that steadiness stepped into the light. Not to overshadow her, but to stand beside her. I imagined her initial shock, then maybe relief. Maybe even gratitude that didn't feel forced or transactional. And beyond that, something I hadn't allowed myself to name directly understanding. If she knew that I had supported her without asking for credit, without attaching conditions, maybe she would see me differently. Not as the serious sister in Chicago, not as the quiet one who never asked for anything, but as someone who had been choosing her consistently, even from a distance. The closer the wedding date came, the more I convinced myself that this was the right timing. A marriage is a beginning, a chance to rewrite patterns. If we were ever going to step out of the roles assigned to us in childhood, this felt like the moment. I spent weeks preparing the gift. Not extravagant, not flashy, intentional. Every detail chosen with care because I believed intention mattered more than spectacle. 3 months. That's how long I carried this plan quietly. 3 months of holding on to the belief that when she opened that box, something between us would shift. Not dramatically. Not in a way that erased the past, but enough. Enough to say we can do this differently now. I didn't expect applause. I didn't expect a public acknowledgement. I only expected honesty. A conversation that might finally happen without defensiveness or comparison. And as I packed for Nashville, placing the gift carefully into my suitcase, I told myself one simple truth. I'm going there to support her, no matter what it costs me. At that point, I still believed the cost would be small. The morning of the wedding felt almost calm. I left my hotel with the gift box resting carefully in my hands, repeating the same sentence in my mind the entire drive to Belmont Mansion. I'm here to support her. The sky was clear, the kind of bright Tennessee blue that makes everything look intentional, almost cinematic. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe the day would unfold exactly as I had imagined. The mansion came into view, grand and polished guests already drifting toward the entrance in soft colors and tailored suits. Laughter carried lightly across the lawn. It looked like the kind of setting Sienna would have chosen, elegant, controlled, perfectly arranged. I stepped toward the gate. A security guard stood just ahead of the entrance, checking names against a list. He glanced at the gift box first, then at me. Name, he asked. Delaney Rhodes's. I said it with confidence. There was no reason not to. He ran his finger slowly down the printed sheet. Once, then again. His brows pulled together in a mild, almost apologetic confusion. Ma'am, he said carefully, your name isn't on the family list. For a second, I assumed he had misread it. I'm the bride's sister, I clarified, leaning slightly closer, lowering my voice as though this were simply a small administrative oversight. He gave a quiet, sympathetic laugh, not mocking, just certain. If that were the case, it would be right here. The words didn't land all at once. They hovered between us. I waited for him to double-check to flip the page to realize the mistake. Instead, footsteps approached from behind him. A man with an assured posture and a tablet tucked under his arm stepped forward. His suit was pressed sharply enough to suggest authority without introduction. Is there a problem? He asked. The guard gestured toward me. The man extended his hand politely. Caleb Turner. I'm overseeing the event. I repeated my name. He scanned the digital list on his tablet with practiced efficiency. His expression didn't shift. No flicker of uncertainty. The family requested that only pre-approved guests be admitted. He said, voice calm but firm. Your name isn't on the approved list. I can't allow entry without direct confirmation. The word family tightened something in my chest. Can you call them? I asked. He hesitated just long enough to signal that he already knew the answer. I'm afraid that won't be possible at the moment. We were given clear instructions. While I stood there trying to process what that meant, movement along the walkway caught my eye. My parents were approaching the entrance. Mom spotted me immediately. Her steps faltered, just slightly. She leaned toward Dad and whispered something I couldn't hear. Then, almost seamlessly, she turned her face forward again as if I were a stranger who had accidentally stepped into the frame of a photograph. Dad's gaze met mine for a fraction of a second. No smile, no confusion, no question. He lifted one shoulder in a small, dismissive shrug and continued walking. They passed within a few feet of me. Neither slowed down. The realization began to settle then, not as a sharp blow, but as something colder. This wasn't miscommunication. They weren't surprised. There was no frantic check of a phone, no rushed explanation. They knew. A few steps beyond them, I saw Sienna. She stood near the edge of the garden with her bridesmaids gathered around her in soft dresses that matched the floral arrangements. Her posture was steady, shoulders, relaxed chin, slightly lifted, the same composed stance she used whenever she wanted to project absolute control. For a brief second, our eyes met. I waited for recognition to transform into action, for her to excuse herself, to walk over, to ask what was happening. Instead, she held my gaze just long enough for me to register the faint curve of her lips. Not warm, not confused, just aware. Then she turned back to her conversation. One of the bridesmaids leaned toward her, whispering something into her ear. Sienna let out a quiet laugh, light, contained, as if nothing outside that circle required her attention. I tightened my grip on the gift box, the corners pressed against my palm, grounding me in the physical weight of it. I had imagined handing it to her, privately, saying something simple and sincere. I want today to be good for both of us. Now I stood outside the gate like an uninvited guest trying to justify her presence. No one came to clarify. No one hurried over with an apology. Guests who recognized me avoided direct eye contact, their expressions carefully neutral. The music drifting from inside the garden continued without interruption. The celebration had already absorbed my absence, and in that stillness it became unmistakably clear. My name had not been forgotten. It had been removed. The decision had been made long before I stepped out of my hotel room that morning. Long before I drove through those gates, believing this day might mend something fragile between us. I looked once more toward the garden. Sienna didn't look back again. There was nothing left to wait for. So I adjusted the gift box in my hands, turned away from the entrance of Belmont Mansion, and walked back toward the parking lot, each step quieter than the one before. That evening, the quiet of my hotel room felt heavier than the silence at the gate. I set the unopened gift box on the small desk by the window and stood there for a long moment, staring at it as if it belonged to someone else. 3 months of intention reduced to something I no longer knew what to do with. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I sat down, opened my laptop, and logged into the investment portal I had created months earlier. The account details appeared exactly as I had left them: structured, stable, deliberate. The fund had done its job. It had carried her company through a vulnerable stretch. Contracts had resumed. Vendor confidence had returned. The projections I'd reviewed weeks earlier had shown a steady upward curve. I hovered over the withdrawal option only briefly. I had offered that support in good faith, quietly, without humiliation, without conditions. But standing outside that gate, watching my parents look through me and my sister turn away without hesitation, something fundamental shifted. Support requires a foundation of mutual respect. What happened that afternoon erased it. I authorized the withdrawal of the entire investment package. Line by line, I reviewed the confirmation screen, making sure there was no room for misinterpretation. The request moved through the system quickly. Within minutes, the fund that had stabilized her business displayed a zero balance. It was done. I closed the laptop gently, as if the softness of the motion might balance the finality of the decision. The following week, the consequences unfolded exactly as the projections had warned they would. Industry updates began circulating, nothing dramatic at first. Subtle notes about delayed contracts, vendors requesting revised guarantees, a tightening of liquidity. I understood the mechanics behind every sentence. The capital infusion had created temporary buoyancy. Without it, the structure beneath was exposed again. Cash flow instability returned almost immediately. By the end of the week, I heard that a corporate client had paused its annual contract pending financial clarification. That single hesitation triggered a chain reaction. Other clients grew cautious, Whispers spread faster than official statements. I felt no satisfaction watching it happen, only recognition. I had stepped in once to prevent this exact unraveling. But I had also learned something important. At the gate, you cannot rescue a relationship by pretending imbalance doesn't exist. 2 days later, I made another decision. I released a short, factual statement through my firm confirming that I had been the anonymous investor behind the recent stabilization of Sienna's company. There were no accusations in it, no emotional commentary, just transparency, a clear timeline, an explanation that the fund had fulfilled its agreed terms and concluded its involvement. I didn't frame it as retaliation. I framed it as closure. The response online moved quickly. People who had followed her company's recovery began connecting pieces that had previously been invisible. Industry circles don't stay quiet for long when financial shifts surface unexpectedly. The next morning, my phone lit up with messages urging me to check Facebook. Sienna had posted a long status. I read it once, slowly. She described a betrayal without naming specifics. She wrote about trust being violated at the worst possible moment. And at the end, in bold, she added a single line, "Delaney just wants to humiliate me." I stared at that sentence longer than the rest. She hadn't called. She hadn't asked for clarification. She hadn't acknowledged the fact that I had supported her when she didn't know she needed it. She had chosen a narrative, publicly, decisively. Within the hour, my phone rang. "Mom, you embarrassed all of us," she said before I could speak. Her tone was clipped, urgent, already aligned with the version of events she had accepted. Fix it. She didn't ask what happened at Belmont Mansion. She didn't ask why I withdrew the investment. She didn't ask how I felt standing outside my own sister's wedding. She demanded compliance. The call ended abruptly, as if the responsibility for resolution had been formally transferred to me. Dad called shortly after. "You created this problem," he said, his voice steady but firm. "You should apologize." The framing was familiar. Peace required my silence. Stability required my submission. The ripple effects of choices I hadn't made were somehow my burden to correct. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain the gate or Caleb Turner or the way they had walked past me without acknowledgement. When he finished, I said only this: "I won't apologize for telling the truth." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not shock, not reflection, just disapproval settling into place. After the calls ended, I sat with the quiet again. I wasn't angry in the way people expect. I wasn't seeking revenge. I hadn't withdrawn the investment to punish her. I had withdrawn it because the relationship it was meant to protect no longer existed in the form I believed it did. A boundary had finally taken shape. For years I had carried responsibility that wasn't entirely mine. I had adjusted, compensated, stayed steady so others wouldn't have to confront discomfort. This time, I refused. I would not accept blame for a narrative I didn't create. I would not apologize for transparency, and I would not continue financing a structure built on exclusion. The line I drew wasn't loud. It didn't require shouting or public spectacle. It required only one thing: standing still when everyone else expected me to bend. The withdrawal did not cause an explosion. It caused a silence. Within days of Delaney pulling the investment, Sienna's company began to wobble in ways that could no longer be disguised as temporary strain. Vendors who had been patient suddenly required deposits up front. A venue partnership quietly dissolved. A long-standing client postponed an event indefinitely. Another chose a competitor. Cash flow, once artificially stabilized, thinned to a visible trickle. Sienna had built her event planning business on charm aesthetics and an ability to make everything look seamless. She was exceptional at atmosphere, at lighting linens, curated playlists, the illusion that life could be arranged into beauty. But behind the scenes, the numbers had never been her strength. She delegated bookkeeping, she smoothed over gaps, she believed momentum could outrun mathematics. Without the anonymous capital cushioning the edges, the gaps widened. Her husband, who had once admired her ambition as much as her confidence, began to ask questions she could not answer with mood boards or reassurances. He wanted statements, projections, clear explanations for transfers that didn't reconcile, and invoices that had been covered by temporary solutions. When he discovered the full scope of the instability, how dependent the business had been on outside money, he had never known existed. Something in his expression shifted from concern to something more final. The confrontation was not dramatic. It was exhausted. He asked when she had planned to tell him. She said she had intended to fix it first. He asked how long it had been like this. She hesitated. That hesitation said enough. Within weeks, he filed for divorce. The paperwork cited irreconcilable differences, but the reality was simpler. Trust had eroded. Financial inconsistencies, once explained away as growing pains, now felt like concealment. The wedding photos still hung in their hallway when the notice arrived. Meanwhile, Sienna's inbox grew quieter. Event planners rely on reputation as much as referrals, and instability travels quickly through industry circles. The Facebook post accusing Delaney of humiliation had generated sympathy in some corners, but it had also prompted questions. Investors talk. Vendors compare notes. Stories don't remain singular for long. When it became known that the withdrawn capital had been substantial and that it had once saved the company from collapse, clients recalculated risk. Contracts slipped through her fingers. Her parents responded the only way they knew how, by shifting urgency. They called Delaney repeatedly. "She's falling apart," her mother said during one late evening voicemail. "You know, she's always been emotional. She needs her sister." Her father was more direct. "You've made your point. Now be compassionate." They spoke as though the unraveling were a family disagreement, rather than the natural consequence of hidden numbers. As though Delaney's silence were cruelty instead of restraint. They did not acknowledge the wedding. They did not acknowledge the removal of her name from the guest list. They did not acknowledge the public accusation. Instead, they focused on restoration of Sienna's stability, of Sienna's comfort. Sienna herself tried to reach out. The first message was brief, "Can we talk?" The second was longer, filled with fragments, confusion about how things had spiraled, frustration at her husband, disappointment in how misunderstandings had grown. The third came late at night. "I never wanted it to go this far." Delaney read each one. She did not respond. Not because she wanted Sienna to suffer, not because she felt vindicated, but because something inside her had settled into clarity. For years, she had been the quiet reinforcement, financially steady, emotionally contained, willing to smooth over fractures no one else wanted to name. She had mistaken endurance for loyalty. She had believed that if she absorbed enough discomfort, the relationship would eventually stabilize. The wedding day had stripped that belief away. Standing outside Belmont Mansion while security turned her back, had not been an accident or a misunderstanding. It had been deliberate. The public nature of it had required coordination. Silence afterward had confirmed intention. That realization had changed something fundamental. Now, as the business faltered and Sienna's marriage dissolved, Delaney understood that stepping in again would not heal anything. It would re-establish the old pattern, Sienna in crisis, Delaney absorbing impact. Her parents framed her, quiet as stubbornness, as pride. But it was neither. It was boundary. In Chicago, Delaney maintained her routines. She went to work. She attended meetings. She kept her apartment orderly and her evenings unremarkable. When colleagues asked about the wedding trip, she said simply that it had been complicated. There was no satisfaction in the news filtering back to her, no sense of triumph as clients withdrew or as divorce proceedings advanced. The unraveling was painful to witness from a distance, even in fragments relayed through strained phone calls. But she did not intervene. Sienna sent one final message. Weeks later, I don't know how to fix this. Delaney stared at the words for a long time. For years, she would have responded immediately with a plan, a spreadsheet, a reassurance. She would have found a way to stabilize what was tipping. Instead, she set her phone down. Some problems, she had learned, are not solved by silent sacrifice. Some relationships cannot be repaired by absorbing more damage. Her silence was not revenge. It was self-preservation, and for the first time in a very long while, she allowed herself to choose it. In the months that followed, Delaney's life did not transform dramatically. It steadied. She stopped waiting for her phone to light up with apologies that would never arrive. She stopped drafting responses in her head to arguments she no longer intended to have. Calls from her parents grew less frequent when it became clear she would not resume her old role. The distance was quiet but intentional. No declarations, no ultimatums, just space. In that space she rebuilt. Her routines in Chicago became anchors rather than distractions. Work felt purposeful again, not as an escape, but as an extension of who she was, competent, measured, accountable. She reconnected with the parts of herself that had existed before family dynamics defined her. Most of all, she leaned into the steady presence of her best friend, Nina Patel. Nina did not offer dramatic advice or take sides. She listened. She reminded Delaney of patterns she had normalized for too long. Over coffee and long evening walks, she gently reframed the narrative. Boundaries were not cruelty. They were clarity. For the first time, Delaney understood that saying no was not an act of punishment. It was an act of self-respect. She had not withdrawn love. She had withdrawn access. And in doing so, she discovered something unexpected. Not loneliness, but peace. If you've stayed with this story until the end, thank you. Truly. These quiet journeys of boundaries, of clarity, of choosing peace often unfold without applause. If any part of Delaney's path resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your reflections matter here. And if you'd like to keep sharing space for stories like this, you're always welcome to follow along.